Hello and welcome to Uncovering Our Hidden History. My name is Anna. I'm a genealogist as well as a historical researcher, and I started this channel to be able to have a platform to be able to show all of the hidden and lied about history that we've been programmed with our entire lives. And so if you have found your way here, welcome. Happy to have you join our community of critical thinkers. So today we are going to be I'm on presentation 7 of my Millennial Reign series. And so if you're new to the channel, please click on the channel icon and go to the playlist and choose the Millennial Reign series and start with video 1. Or you can just watch today's video and then go back and watch, but it will probably make more sense to you if you start with the first video and I build upon each one. And so we have so much to talk about today, so I'll see you in a minute. Okay, you guys, you ready to get started? Hope you're all doing well and trying to stay cool. Oh my goodness, what a summer. I don't know about where you're at, but here in Southern California, we are just getting baked. It's definitely a not normal summer. We're having like temperatures in like 80-85 with 60 to 70% humidity, which is just not how we roll on the coast. And so it's been a little bit not fun being outside, so definitely grateful for the air conditioning, but I'm assuming everybody is getting hit with this very abnormal heat and high temperatures. So anyway, definitely looking forward to fall. So anyway, we do have a lot to talk about today, and so let's get going. My videos are always very long as it is, so I'm going to try to just keep moving along. All right, so this is this should be part 7. I thought I changed that, but this should be part 7 of our Millennial Reign of Messiah series. So I apologize. This is part 7. Okay, and so here's our fair use warning. Just lets me share information for teaching purposes without infringing on any copyright laws. Okay, and so because it has been a few weeks, let's go ahead and review where we left off in the last part 6 video. Again, this is part 7. Okay, so from part 6, we went over, we were in Daniel and we went through the prophecies of Daniel. And so just to recap, Nebuchadnezzar's statue and Daniel's 4 beasts refer to the same kingdoms. So I have them side by side there. And then you can also notice with regards to the image of Nebuchadnezzar's statue with the gold, silver, bronze, iron, so on and so forth, the empires that go along with those and where they were on the BC AD timeline is underlined so that you'll know when those empires rose. Hippolytus's end time teaching from his published work, The Antichrist, section 28. It was the summary of the image in Daniel's beasts. He confirms that the golden head of the image and the lioness the beast that was the lioness denoted the Babylonians. The shoulder and arms of silver on the image, and the bear from Daniel's beast represent the Persians and the Medes. The belly and thighs of brass on Nebuchadnezzar's image and the leopard from Daniel's beast are the Greeks, who held the sovereignty from Alexander's time. The legs of iron and the beast most dreadful and terrible express the Roman Empire, not just the Romans, but the Roman Empire, and that's key, who hold the sovereignty at present, he said. And the toes of the feet, which were part clay and part iron, and also the 10 horns, were emblems of the kingdoms that are yet to rise. Now again, this is what Hippolytus wrote at that time. And that was, I believe, he had died somewhere in the mid to late 200s, I believe. So, and then he said, the little horn that grows up among them means the Antichrist being in their midst of those kingdoms that would rise. And then the stone that smites the earth and brings judgment upon the world was and is Messiah. Okay, now I'm not going to actually go through and read these just in the interest of time. So I suggest that you guys pause the video and you can read them, or take screenshots. Okay, I'll just kind of pause for a sec for each one. So Daniel chapter 8 basically is the interpretation of the beast. Oh, yes. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these. And then Hippolytus in his section 29 said, we should reveal the mysteries. These things, beloved, we impart to you with fear and yet readily on account of the love of Messiah, which surpasses all. For if the blessed prophets who preceded us did not choose to proclaim these things, even though they knew them openly and boldly, lest they should disquiet, to disrupt or to alarm the souls of men, but they recounted them mystically in parables and dark sayings, speaking thus, here is the mind which has wisdom. So how much greater risk shall we, he's saying the apostolic fathers in their time, endure in venturing to declare openly the things spoken of by those who had spoken in obscure terms. So he's saying those of us, he said, the prophets of old understood these things. They knew these things, but they didn't want to disquiet or alarm the souls of men. So they spoke in parables and kind of cloaked them. But he's saying, we who are living so close to these end times, the apostolic fathers and then their disciples and such, he said, it's a much greater risk for us to speak about them openly. And he said, section 32, the accuracy of Daniel. Speak with me, O blessed Daniel. Give me full assurance, I beseech thee. You prophesied concerning the lioness in Babylon, for you were a captive there. You unfolded the future regarding the bear, for you were still living, and you saw the things come to pass. Then you spoke of the leopard. How could you have known this, for you had already died? Who instructed you to announce these things? But he who had formed you in your mother's womb. That was the Most High God, you said. You spoke the truth and you did not lie. The leopard has arisen. The he-goat has come. He has smitten the ram, and he has broken his horn in pieces. And that's speaking of, I believe it was Darius and Alexander. He has stamped upon him with his feet. He has been exiled by his fall. The 4 horns have come up from under that one. is speaking of the kingdom of Alexander after his death, where he partitioned it under 4 of his generals. He said, but rejoice, blessed Daniel, you were not wrong. All of these things have come to pass. Which now brings us to today's presentation. And we're going to talk about the rise of the 4th beast, the Roman Empire. So here is a picture of Augustus Caesar. And Augustus was born Gaius Octavius on the 23rd of September, 63 BC. And he died on the 19th of August, AD 14. He was the founder of the Roman Empire. And he was the first Roman emperor from BC 27 unto his death in AD 14. The reign of Augustus initiated an imperial cult and an era of imperial peace known as the Pax Romana, which lasted for approximately 200 years, beginning in BC 27 and ending about AD 180. Now, so even though he died, what he established lasted for about 200 years, the Pax Romana. The style of government known as the Principate, in which the emperor showed nominal deference to the Senate, was established during his reign and lasted until the 3rd century. Augustus's great uncle, Julius Caesar, named Augustus as his primary heir, and after Julius Caesar's assassination in BC 44, Octavian inherited his estate and assumed his name. He fought for the loyalty of Caesar's legions. He was made a senator during a state of emergency and then seized power by marching on Rome in BC 43, becoming its youngest elected consul. After the demise of the triumvirate, Augustus reached an accord with the remaining old Roman elite families. He would restore the facade of a free republic centered around the Senate, the executive magistrates, and the legislative assemblies. But his control of the military and half of Rome's provinces meant that he maintained autocratic power, legitimized by his appointment as commander-in-chief of most of Rome's armies. To avoid the appearance of being a monarch or a dictator, he eventually refused to stand for re-election to the consulship. But the Senate granted him the powers of the tribunate, censorship, and the titles of Princeps. Augustus, so Princeps Augustus was his title, and Pater Patriae, which means father of the country, and named the month of August after him. So that was according to Wikipedia. But what you need to know is before Augustus, we had let me come back here. So we had a demarcation. Under Julius Caesar and the leaders before them, which were primarily military, Rome was a republic. Okay? So once Augustus inherited that position from his great uncle Julius Caesar, he then took it to a whole other level and gave the appearance. So when it was a republic, the Senate had a lot more control over the provinces. But when Augustus took over, he let there seem like there was a facade where the Senate still had that same kind of power. But what he did is he was actually the first Roman emperor and created the empire, which is the beast. It is the fourth beast system. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So what Wikipedia doesn't want you to know, and what they conveniently left out, is the birth story around Augustus's conception. So Octavian Augustus' conception comes to us from the well-known Roman historian and biographer Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. And a lot of times his writings are just under Suetonius, okay? Otherwise known as Suetonius. In his writing of the life of Augustus, so the life of Augustus comes from a larger work that Suetonius did called the life of the 12 Caesars. Okay, and he starts that with Julius Caesar and goes on. So the life of Augustus, chapter 94.4, comes from that larger work of the lives of the 12 Caesars. Okay, and what Suetonius wrote was the following. He says, I read in the writings of Asclepius. I apologize ahead of time. I'm not very good at these Roman names. So I believe that's Asclepius, concerning the gods that were worshipped at Mendes, that Attia, who was the mother of Augustus Caesar, coming at midnight to the solemnities performed in honor of the god Apollo at his temple, and bringing her litter into the temple. And so for those of you that don't know, when they say her litter, it's like a couch that had 4 poles, and usually there was like curtains or things that came down, and so the nobles and the royalty would be carried about on the shoulders of like 4 slaves or whatever from point A to point B. And so she had been brought to Apollo's temple on her litter, carried in, and then set down. And then it said, while the rest of her matrons, or the matrons around her, only slumbered, she fell into a profound, deep sleep, at which time a dragon all of a sudden crept up to her couch, her litter, and presently returned again, or left again. Upon which, when she awoke, it was as if she had been in the embraces of her husband, as if she had been intimate with her husband. And then she therefore purified herself, and immediately she found a mole, and it's not a mole like what we would think of a mole. It's a mark. She found a mark in her body resembling the picture of a dragon, which, because it could never be got out or removed, she ever afterwards abstained from going to the public baths. And then Augustus was born in the 10th month after this accident, or this occurrence, and for that reason is thought to be the son of Apollo. And so, just to kind of repeat that again, we have Augustus Caesar, Gaius Octavian's mother, being brought along with the other ladies to Apollo's temple on a specific night where there was a celebration or a worship, or having like a solemn ceremony there. And then they all slept there. And it's saying, Suetonius says, while the rest of the matrons only, slept, normal sleep, Attia went into a very deep sleep. And then a dragon came and laid with her, and then left again. And then as she woke from that, she had the sensation in her body of having been intimate with her husband. And then she had been marked by the dragon with a picture of a dragon which she could not wash off, which is why she never went to the public baths after that, because she didn't, want to be stared at. And then Augustus was born 10 months later. And pregnancy is, there's nothing peculiar about in the 10th month, because pregnancy is usually a full 9 months. And so, yes, so it was believed that the people who knew about this believed that Apollo had visited her. And so now a dragon, we've talked about this before with the fallen seraphim angels. They do resemble dragons. The seraphim, the definition of seraphim is a burning one or a fiery one. And so, yeah, so you can take that for what you will. Now, I do find it interesting because when I was just doing some regular research, a lot, on this lore, this conception story, a lot of times it would say she was visited by a serpent, which we've also studied before. Serpent can mean many things. The seraphim are known as, fiery serpents, but it could also be a snake. It could mean dragon. Serpent is a very ambiguous term. So I find it interesting that a lot of the other sites I was looking at did not, they used the term serpent. I had a sneaking suspicion it was more than that, so I actually went on to archive.org actually and looked up Suetonius's work, the Life of the 12 Caesars, and found this directly. And sure enough, he doesn't say serpent, he says dragon. So let's kind of put two and two together here. We have Julius Caesar, who had been Caesar over the Republic of Rome, right? And the ones before him, they're fierce military leaders. But then all of a sudden, we see Augustus Caesar taking over after Julius Caesar's death. And we have this story regarding his conception. And then, lo and behold, he creates something completely different. He takes Rome to a whole new level and creates the Roman Empire himself. So in my opinion, I think it's safe to say that Augustus would have been a Nephilim. He would have been, if his mother had been impregnated by a seraphim dragon, and if that had been Apollo, if that entity had been Apollo, then we have a fallen, we have a spiritual being and a human female, and by definition that is a Nephilim. So we have a demigod here who just coincidentally creates the Roman Empire and becomes the first Roman emperor. So take that for what you will. So, and he's not the only one. So there were other celebrated, well-known conquerors with similar conception accounts. And so I want to remind you what Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 has to say, right? Scripture. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, ... and also afterwards, when the sons of Elohim came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Okay, so Darius the Mede, born about 600 BC, died about BC 537. Okay, from his own inscription at the Nagshi E. Rostam, it says Darius the Great's inscription at that place near Persepolis in what is now modern day Iran He says, I am Darius the Great, King of Kings, King in Persia, King of countries containing all kinds of men, King of this expansive land. From long ago, we have been noble. Our family have been kings. Persian, the son of a Persian. Aryan, exclamation point, from the Aryan race. Okay. So he's basically saying, I'm not normal, right? I'm not like the rest of you. I'm something extra. Cyrus the Great, who came after him. BC, he lived BC 590. Actually, I think, so he was a little older though, to BC 530. And they tended to kind of rule together in the Media area. And they were the, Babylon, Medo-Persia. So, according to Herodotus, the Median king Astyages had a prophetic dream that his daughter Mandane would give birth to a vine that would grow so vast it would cover all of Asia and overthrow his throne. Terrified of this destiny, Astyages tried to have the infant Cyrus killed, setting off a classic mythic hero survival story among shepherds. So, not quite as dramatic, but Cyrus was a little extra as well. All of these conquerors were. And then Alexander the Great. Okay, I found a little bit more on him, and of course, he represents the Greek Empire. And he lived from BC 356 to BC 323. So his life was very short. I think he died when he was about 30. And it said, what I found on him is it says the last native Egyptian. And the reason it's native Egyptian is technically the original Mizraim came from Ham's line. Okay. So this Nectanebo was the last native Egyptian, because then the Greek Ptolemies took over after, and they were not native Egyptians. So this last native Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo, prophesied to Olympias, who was Alexander's mother, that she would be visited by Amun-Ra, an Egyptian god with the body of a man and a ram's head, and that she would conceive a child by him. Another widespread story known throughout the Macedonian court claimed that Olympias was visited and impregnated by the god Zeus, often depicted as a serpent, so again, probably a dragon, lying beside her. When Alexander occupied Egypt in late BC 332, he was regarded as a liberator, thus conquering Egypt without a fight. He was pronounced the son of Amun-Ra by the oracle at Siwa. Amun-Ra was identified as a form of Zeus, and Alexander often referred to Zeus Ammon as his true father. And after his death, so his human father was Philip of Macedon, right? And that was the husband to Olympias. But again, we have here another situation where Alexander is, apparently it was a very well-known or understood thing at that time, that his mother had been impregnated by Zeus, or Zeus Ammon, or Zeus Amun-Ra. And that was his true father. And after his death, currency depicted him adorned with the horns of Ammon as a symbol of his divinity. As the chief deity of the Egyptian empire, Amun-Ra also came to be worshipped outside of Egypt, according to the testimony of ancient Greek historiographers in Libya and Nubia. As Zeus Ammon and Jupiter Ammon, Alexander came to be identified with Zeus in Greek and Jupiter in Rome. Same god, but they just changed the names. You know, the Greek called him Zeus and the Romans called him Jupiter. Same entity. Okay, and then to the right is a picture of Alexander as Zeus Ammon. And it says, the Greeks of the lower Nile Delta and Cyrenaica combined the features of the supreme god Zeus with the features of the Egyptian god Amun-Ra. Then, of course, Julius Caesar, born BC 100 and died BC 44. Julius Caesar dedicated a grand temple to Venus, the mother, in Rome in order to honor his divine ancestress and patron goddess. He believed he was descended from Venus, which again is another entity, right? Because his patrician family, the gens Lulia, traced its lineage back to Lulus, also called Ascanius, and Lulus was the son of the Trojan prince Aeneas, who was the legendary offspring of the goddess Venus and the mortal Anchises. So here we have a female, Nephilim with a mortal male. So a little atypical. And Aeneas survived the fall of Troy and traveled to Italy, tying his bloodline to the foundational myths of Rome. And then we come to Merovic, who was the founder of the Frankish Merovingians. Okay. Despite the carefully listed genealogies of his time, the heritage of Merovic, progenitor of the Merovingians, was strangely obscured in the monastic annals. Although he was the rightful son and heir of Clodion, human, the historian Priscus said that he had been sired by an arcane sea creature known as the Bistia Neptunus. The 7th century Chronicle of Fredegar records that while his mother, the wife of King Clodion, was bathing in the sea during a hot summer day, she was assaulted and impregnated by a mysterious sea creature resembling a quinotar, a 5-horned bull-like sea monster. So again, when you understand that the marine kingdom, we have an earth kingdom, we have a marine kingdom. So gods like Poseidon and Triton, which I think they're the same entity, but you have the Fisher Kings, for example, right? These entities are real and they are in the ocean. So the marine kingdom is very much a real thing. And so these are not just stories. Now, our historians today would like you to believe they are, right? They'll just like, when we see all of the statues of all the, the Greek gods or the Roman gods and all the strange hybrid creatures, right? We're told it's just mythology. It's just mythology. But we know from Genesis, we know from the book of Enoch, we know from a lot of these extra biblical books that no, those beings were quite real. Okay. Then we come to Genghis Khan. So we're just moving forward in history here. So Genghis Khan lived from 1162 AD to 1227 AD. And according to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Genghis Khan was born into the Borchikaun, which means blue gray-eyed people. Genghis himself had fiery red hair and blue or green eyes. The ancestral mother and founder of the Borchikhan clan was known as Alan Gua, and according to the Mongol and Chinese legends, Alan Gua was said to have been visited in her tent by a divine being who possessed golden hair, a fair complexion, and gray eyes. This divine being impregnated her, and 9 to 10 months later she gave birth to her first child, who was the first member of the Borchikhan clan, and left her with sons destined to rule the Mongol clans. Now, you do any type of history research on the Mongols, and they terrorized, they were a terror that came from the east going all the way to Europe in the 1300s and 1400s, and they definitely ruled, and they left, and we still, a lot of the Tartarian Khans are descended from Genghis. So these conquerors, these men of renown, these Nephilim or giants, or hybrids, demigods, pick your name, they were extraordinary, and they usually were very fierce. They usually were of larger stature, and conquerors. So they just were, extra everything. And then, as we learned from the last video, Antiochus IV, who gave himself the surname Epiphanes, and he was the Greek ruler so he lived from BC 215 to BC 164. He was the Greek ruler of the Seleucid kingdom, and by Antiochus taking the epithet Epiphanes, he was declaring himself to be a god. In fact, he claimed to be Zeus. So we have Zeus again, incarnated. So Zeus in him, living through his body. Now, I looked to see if I could find a conception story regarding Antiochus. I could not. But if he claimed to be Zeus incarnated, then either his mom had a divine being baby daddy, or I don't know, something. Or else he just let this entity come in and inhabit him, one of the two. But I could not find any lore or stories about him. In Jerusalem, he set up so he came in and decided that he wanted to annex Jerusalem and Judea to his kingdom, to a Seleucid kingdom. He kind of was on a rampage, and he went to war and against the Ptolemy king of Egypt at that time, and then he set his sights on Jerusalem. So once he got into Jerusalem, he set up a statue of Zeus in the most holy place. He plundered and looted the temple, and then he had all of the sacred vessels carried off to his home country. Antiochus stopped the daily sacrifices, banned all religious practices, including circumcision, and he burned the sacred scriptures. Violators caught with any scriptures were put to death. The book of Revelation and the Apostolic Fathers often refer back to him when talking about the future end-time Antichrist and the abomination of desolation. So if you read through the things that Messiah said in the Gospels, and then also in Acts, and then when the Apostle John did the book of Revelation, anytime it talks about the abomination of desolation, like Messiah told his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation being set up, that's your cue to flee. Okay. John talked about it. And so if you click on the notes, it will refer you back to Antiochus Epiphanes. So kind of my take on that is that the same entity that inhabited Antiochus would also inhabit the end times Antichrist that they were expecting at that time. Okay, so, and I just put here that if our humanist friends think that all of what I just went through is nonsense, or that these stories are just allegory, let's refer back to, again, I already put up Genesis 6 verse 4, but then we also have the first book of Enoch, we have Jude, and we have the Testament of Reuben as witnesses to the contrary. Okay, so in Enoch, book 1, chapter 6, it said, "And it came to pass when the sons of men had increased, that in those days there were born to them fair and beautiful daughters." This almost repeats verbatim from Genesis 6:4. But in Genesis 6:4, it says that the sons of Elohim came to them. And here Enoch is very specific and says, "The angels, the sons of heaven, saw the women and desired them. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children.' And Semyaza, who was their leader, said to them, 'Well, I fear that you may not wish this deed to be done, and that I'm alone going to have to pay for this great sin.' And they all answered him and said, 'Let us all swear an oath and bind one another with curses.' So not to alter this plan, but to carry it out effectively. So then they all swore together and all bound one another with curses to it. And they were in all 200, and they came down on Ardis, which is the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon, because on it they swore and bound each other, one another with curses." And then in chapter 7 it says, "And they took wives for themselves, and everyone chose for himself one each. And they began to go into them, they visited them, and were promiscuous with them, and they taught them charms and spells, and they showed them the cutting of roots and trees. And they became pregnant and bore large giants, and the height of the giants was 3,000 cubits." So most of us don't understand the measurement of cubits, and so I did a little math for you here. So if you look up how much is a cubit, right? Just a normal cubit. I'm not even going with a royal cubit, because royal cubit is usually can be 20 to 22 inches. So just a normal human cubit would be 18 inches. So we're told that these large giants, these original first generation Nephilim, were 3,000 cubits. So if we take 3,000 times 18 inches, we get 54,000. So now we need to know how many feet is that. So then take 54,000 and divide it by 12 for 12 inches, okay, which is 1 foot. And that brings us to 4,500 feet tall. Those giants, the Nephilim, we're told were 4,500 feet tall. And so for perspective, the California redwoods up in Northern California, specifically the sequoia trees, can reach heights of 380 feet at the height of their maturity. If any of you have ever gone to visit the redwoods and seen the sequoias, there's nothing like them. And yet they are only usually up to about 380 feet tall. Okay, so let that sink in. From the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, specifically from the Testament of Reuben, the firstborn son of Jacob and Leah, it says, For a woman, so Reuben, so the testament, let me backstory here. So the testaments of the 12 patriarchs it's an extra biblical book where each of the sons of Jacob, as they're getting ready to die, they know that they're, apparently they knew when they were going to die. If you read like the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Apocalypse of Job, some of these other ones, they were usually visited by an angel and they were told to get their affairs in order because they were about to die. So each one of these, of the 12 sons of Jacob, would get their affairs in order, and then they would call all of their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren to come, and then they would bless them, and then they would tell them anything that they needed to know going forward. So Reuben was telling his descendants, he says, for a woman cannot force a man openly, but by a harlot's bearing she beguiles him. Flee therefore fornication, my children, and command your wives and your daughters that they adorn not their heads and faces in order to deceive the mind, especially the mind of men. Basically, don't dress and put on all this makeup and braid your hair and put all these tinkling ornaments on to beguile or to deceive the mind of a man, and don't basically be a harlot. He says, because every woman who uses these wiles has been reserved for eternal punishment. For thus they allured the watchers who were before the flood. For as these watchers continually beheld them, they lusted after them, the women, and they conceived the act in their mind. For the watchers changed themselves into the shape of men. So hello, shapeshifter, right? They can appear as anything. So these watchers were lusting after these human women who had adorned themselves as harlots and changed themselves into the shape of men and appeared to the women as they were with their husbands in intimate ways. And the women, lusting in their minds after the forms of the gods, of the watchers, then gave birth to giants, for the watchers appeared to them as reaching even unto the heavens. So there is something we don't understand. There's something missing that we don't understand. But apparently, as these women were in physical acts of intimacy with their husbands, but with their minds, they were lusting after these beings, and somehow these beings, I don't know if they superimposed themselves or what happened, but this is how the Nephilim, or these giants, were conceived. I mean, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, but this is what we're told happened. Now, just to put a little perspective here, the book of Jude, which only has one chapter, in verses 6 to 8 and 11, expounds a bit on this. And Jude said, this is the Apostle Jude, he says, and the angels who did not stay within their own realm of authority, but left their appointed dwellings, their appointed dwelling, the Most High has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Yet, in like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. And then other translations, you might find them called, these people called filthy dreamers, Okay, so, and this is referring back to what we just read, ties back to what we just read in the Testament of Reuben. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves. So I think it's, most of the inference here is that the women that were doing this were descendants of Cain, potentially. So all that the reason I went over all of that is because Scripture is clear that there were Nephilim and there were giants before the flood, but then also afterwards. And so I just wanted to name a few of those that are well known to our history books. They definitely will qualify as Nephilim and demigods, and you can look at their lives, and interesting, they're the same people that are tied to Nebuchadnezzar's statue, as well as Daniel's beast empires. These men created beast empires, and I'm sure there may be more, but those are the ones that came to mind that I could find information on. So anyway, here's a map showing the Roman Republic at the beginning of Julius Caesar's civil war, so around circa BC 49. So you can see that Julius Caesar had the western areas, which are in blue, and then you can see that the areas that the Roman Senate controlled. So he didn't have absolute power. That did not happen until his successor, Augustus Caesar. So now we can see here the provinces of the Roman Empire under Augustus. And again, he lived BC 63 to 14 AD. But we know from earlier in the presentation that his Pax Romana, what he had put into place, lasted for upwards of 200 years. So if you look here, you would have to take a screenshot of this and then make it bigger, but in the upper right hand corner is like a legend for you, a map legend, and you can see the different provinces. But this is all of this in the middle, all of this, including northern Africa, like Mauritania and Nubia and Egypt and Libya. No, maybe not Libya, but the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar was huge. Okay. Following the death of Augustus in 14 AD, the Roman Empire transitioned smoothly through its established succession to his stepson Tiberius, and maintaining the Pax Romana for decades. However, the centralized autocracy that he built, experienced severe political instability under the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and then centuries of eventual decline, and then the eventual collapse of the Western Empire, which we'll get to in an upcoming video. So Tiberius, his stepson, took over after Augustus and continued the Pax Romana. He took power reluctantly, it says, ruling as a cautious and capable, although deeply unpopular administrator. And then after him, we have Caligula, who was a mess and quite sadistic, and then Claudius. It says erratic and tyrannical rule under Caligula led to his assassination, followed by Claudius, who stabilized the administration and then expanded the empire into Britain. Nero came next, and he was infamous for his tyranny and for starting the Great Fire of Rome and then blaming it on the Christians. His chaotic downfall sparked the brief year of what we call the Four Emperors, where there was like 4 emperors in quick succession after his death. So then here's another map of during the expansion and that is called the Golden Age. The Flavian dynasty brought stability and built iconic landmarks such as the Colosseum. And then during what we call the adoptive emperors, rulers like Trajan, Hadrian, like Hadrian, you would know him, he built Hadrian's Wall in Britain, and then Marcus Aurelius. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural peak under those emperors. And again, there's a map legend in the upper right corner. So you might want to take screenshots of these for your own research. And you're welcome to take screenshots of any of these slides for your own research. I do not mind at all. So the Roman Empire was to some extent a victim of its own success. It became so large that it incorporated many different regions and cultures. And as it grew, so did its borders. And as a result, attacks and unwanted border crossings, predominantly by Goths and other barbarian groups, became more and more common and difficult to deal with in an effective manner. So, like the Roman Empire is huge. And so it's the Roman Empire, but like America, for example, right? All of the states, America is a huge land made up of many states. And while those of us here are called Americans, you've got Germans, you've got Italians, you've got Scandinavian people, you've got Scots. It's said that there's more people from Scotland living in America that are actually left living in Scotland. You've got Irish. You've got, every known culture. A lot of English people have moved here. So this is a land of many cultures and ethnicities, but all would call themselves American that live here, especially the ones born here or their children born here. So the Roman Empire was a lot like this. It encompassed all of Gaul at that time, and then also and then from Gaul they carved out Hispania, Portugal, and then the northern parts of Africa were part of that. It expanded all the way over to all of Greek and all of the Greek colonies, and went, quite a bit to the east, stopping where it bordered Persia. So it was a humongous territory. And because it had grown so, and then so again, you've got all of these different cultures, and then you start having the Goths come in, and then some of the Germanic tribes, and they were allowed to come in, as military because they were tremendous warriors. So they come in as military leaders, and then over time get moved into prominent, positions. So not everybody in Roman authority was actually Latin or Roman. And then two additional factors compounded the basic problem of the distance, and that is, number one, the rise of Persia to superpower status in the 3rd century, which would be the 200s AD, which meant Rome had to have an emperor somewhere close to the Persian frontier because there were constant battles with Persia, which again today we know as modern day Iran. And then the second factor is that by the 4th century AD, which is all of the 300s, the definition of Roman had changed to encompass provincial elites all the way from Scotland to Babylon. Many Romans, given the enormous size of the empire, had little or no affiliation with the city of Rome itself. Splitting the empire splitting the Roman Empire, it was thought, would make it easier to oversee all of these various, often very different regions and cultures encompassed within it. Which brings us to Emperor Diocletian, who, by the way, was one of the most tyrannical with regards to the Christians and the persecution of them. He had an all-out vendetta against them and persecuted them all across the Roman Empire. You know, sometimes with some of the other emperors, there would, be, how would I say it? There would be persecution maybe in different parts of the Roman Empire, but with Diocletian, he had persecution status for the whole empire. And so it was very, very difficult for the Christians at that time. So it says, the principle of the collegiate rulership, which means having more than one emperor, had been part of the framework of imperial government for more than a century at that point. Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 AD, experimented with various configurations of imperial government. Like, experimented with different ways of trying to split the government to have more oversight and control, because just one man, one emperor, couldn't be everywhere at once. So Diocletian eventually established a tetrarchy, meaning a rule of 4 divisions between 2 senior emperors, with their rank being that of Augusti, after Augustus Caesar, 1 in the east, so 1 Augusti in the east, and then 1 Augusti in the west. And then there would be 2 junior rulers underneath them, being of the rank of Caesar. And so here you can see a map of the Roman Empire divided between Western Rome, and then Eastern Rome. And then within Western Rome, you have a prefecture over Gaul, and then a prefecture over Italy and Africa. And then in the Eastern Roman Empire, you have a prefecture or an Augusti over Illyricum, and a Caesar over the prefecture of Illyricum, and then a prefecture or an Augusti over just Eastern Rome. And so this is what Diocletian did. So key regions before the Roman Empire split. So on the right, it says Roman provinces after Augustus. It says after the death of Augustus, the Roman Empire was divided into several provinces, still just one empire and one emperor, but they had different provinces. And so there was the Egypt province, that was established in 30 BC, and then Hispania in 27 BC, then Gallia or Gaul in 27 BC, and then Achaia in 27 BC. And so the Western Roman territories would have been Britannia, Gaul and France, Spain and Portugal, Italy, and then the Proconsularis in North Africa, which included Numidia. And then in the Eastern Roman territories, you had Egypt, Western Turkey, which back then would have been Anatolia. Western Turkey is a more modern label. And then Cappadocia, Syria, Judea, and Macedonia. And then Achaia is Greece. And then Dacia was Romania, or what we call modern day Romania, and then Pannonia is Hungary in the Balkans. So if you look at maps and you see the ancient names, such as Macedonia, Achaia, Dacia, Pannonia, those are their more modern day counterparts. So what happened? Well, the Tetrarchy fell apart shortly after Diocletian's abdication in 305 AD, with various Augusti and Caesars battling for power, because there's always going to be power struggles, right? You get a little bit of power and then you want more. And then you don't want to share power. But the Roman Empire was once again reunited when Constantine I, also known as Constantine the Great, who was Emperor of the West, defeated his other co-rulers, including his brother-in-law Licinius, by 324 AD. Constantine thereby became the sole emperor, once again, of both the West and the East, thereby reuniting the Roman Empire into one empire again, with one ruler. Which brings us to, and there's a reason I'm laying all of these things out, you guys. We probably have another 2, maybe 3 videos before we get to the day of wrath or the end times, that all of the apostolic fathers talked about, and who, when I name who I believe was the Antichrist at that time, or was the Antichrist that was referred to by the Apostle John in Revelations. So 2, but possibly 3 videos. We'll get to that. But Constantine is definitely very important, because there was a lot that happened with Constantine. Okay, so now we're going to go into Constantine and the Byzantine Empire. And many of you are probably going to go, the what? Because we don't get taught about the Byzantine Empire very much, and there's a good reason for that. So I found a fabulous book on archive.org. It's from a series. So the author is C.W.C. Oman, and he did a series called The Story of the Nations. And this one is the story of the Byzantine Empire. And I love that he actually has drawings and things to go along with it. And it was published in London in 1892. So it's an old book, which you know I love. Okay, so it's really important that I read the next few slides to you so that you get a feel for what the Byzantine Empire was before Constantine took over, especially because they don't teach this a lot. So again, this was published in 1892. So I'm assuming that the author, wrote this somewhere between 1890 to 1892 to its being published. It says 2,558 years ago, from 1892, a little fleet of galley ships toiled painfully against the current up the long strait of the Hellespont, rowed across the broad Propontis, and came to anchor in the smooth waters of the first inlet which cuts into the European shore of the Bosphorus. There a long crescent-shaped creek, which after ages was to be known as the Golden Horn, strikes inland for 7 miles, forming a quiet backwater from the rapid stream which runs just outside it. On the headland, enclosed between this inlet and the open sea, a few hundred colonists disembarked from their galley ships and hastily secured themselves from the wild tribes of the inland by running some rough sort of stockade across the ground from the beach, from beach to beach. Thus was founded the city of Byzantium. The settlers were Greeks of the Dorian race, natives of the thriving seaport state of Megara, Again, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Megara, one of the most enterprising of all the cities of Hellas in the time of colonial and commercial expansion, which was then at its height. Wherever a Greek prow had cut its way into unknown waters, there Megarian seamen were soon found following in its wake. One band of these venturesome traders of Megarians pushed far to the west to plant colonies in Sicily, but the larger share of the group of Megara was turned towards the sunrise, towards the mist-enshrouded entrance of the Black Sea and the fabulous lands that lay beyond it. There, as legends told, was to be found the realm of the Golden Fleece, which was the El Dorado of the ancient world, where kings of untold wealth reigned over the tribes of the Colchis. There dwelt by the banks of the river Thermodon the Amazons, the warlike women who had once vexed far-off Greece by their inroads. There, too, was to be found, if one could just struggle far enough up its northern shore, the land of the Hyperboreans, the blessed folk who dwell behind the north wind and know nothing of storm and winter. It's kind of like, I think they're saying, it's like being behind the waterfall. So there's peace and calm when you get behind a waterfall, if you can get behind it. So they're saying that the Hyperboreans don't have to experience the extreme storms and winters because they dwell on the other side of that. To seek these fabled wonders, the Greeks sailed, the Megarians, sailed ever north and east until they had come to the extreme limits of the sea. The riches of the Golden Fleece, however, they did not find, nor did they find the country of the Hyperboreans, nor the tribes of the Amazons. But they did discover many lands well worth the knowing, and they grew rich on the profits which they drew from the metals of the Colchis and the forests of the Paphlagonia, from the rich corn lands by the banks of the Dnieper and Bug, and then the fisheries of the Bosphorus and the Maeotic Lake. Presently, the whole coastland of the sea, which the Greeks on their first coming called the Axenos, or the Axenos, which means the inhospitable, became fringed with trading settlements, and therefore its name then was changed to the Euxenos, or the Euxine Sea, what we now call the Black Sea, and Euxenos means hospitable, in recognition of its friendly ports. It was in a similar spirit that 2,000 years later, the seamen who led the next great impulse of exploration that rose in Europe turned the name of the Cape of Storms into that of the Cape of Good Hope. The Megarians, almost more than any other Greeks, devoted their attention to the Euxine, or the Euxine, and the foundation of Byzantium was but just one of their many achievements. Already, 17 years before Byzantium came into being, another band of Megarian colonists had established themselves at Chalcedon, on the opposite Asiatic shore of the Bosphorus. Okay. The settlers that were destined to found the greater city applied to the Oracle of Delphi to give them advice as to the site of their new home, and Apollo, we are told, bade them to build their town over against the city of the blind. They therefore pitched upon the headland by the Golden Horn, reasoning that the Chalcedonians were truly blind to have neglected the more eligible site on the Thracian side of the shore in order to found a colony on the far less inviting Bithynian side of the strait. From the first, its situation marked out Byzantium as destined for a great future. Alike from the military and from the commercial point of view, no city could have been better placed. Looking out from the easternmost headland of Thrace, with all of Europe behind it and all of Asia before it, it was equally well suited to be the frontier fortress to defend the border. And then, as you can see, to the map to the right, you can see like where Byzantine is. And that's where they had set up. And they drew much profit from its fisheries, so much so that the city badge, its coat of arms, as we would call it, comprised a tunny fish, or I guess what we would call a tuna fish, as well as the famous ox whose form had alluded to the legend of the naming of the Bosphorus. As an independent state, Byzantium had a long and eventful history. For 30 years, it was in the hands of the kings of Persia. But with that short exception, it maintained its freedom during the first 300 years that followed its founding. Many stirring scenes took place beneath its walls. It was close to those walls that the great Darius, the Mede, threw across the Bosphorus his bridge of boats, which served as a model for the more famous structure on which his son Xerxes crossed the Hellespont. We know comparatively little about the internal history of these early centuries of the life of Byzantium. Some odd fragments of information survive here and there. We know, for example, that the Byzantiums, or the Megarians, used iron instead of copper for small money, a peculiarity shared by no other ancient state except for Sparta. Their alphabet, rejoiced in an abnormally shaped B, which puzzled all of the other Greeks, for it resembled that little sign that you see there. Looks kind of like two T's put together, with an extra limb. The chief gods of the city were those that we might have expected. Poseidon, the ruler of the sea, whose blessing gave Byzantium its chief wealth, and Demeter, the goddess who presided over the Thracian and Scythian corn lands, which formed its second source of prosperity. So again, we would expect where they were located. They were worshiping, the marine kingdom. But then also Demeter, or Demeter, however you say that. It was not until the rise of Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander's father, Olympias's husband. Well, Philip was the human, father, and his greater son Alexander the Great, that Byzantium fell for the 5th time into the hands of an enemy. The elder king was repulsed from the city's walls after a long siege. So it sounds like Philip of Macedon had come in and had laid siege to Byzantium. But the elder king was repulsed from the city's walls after a long siege, culminating in an attempt at an escalade by night, which was frustrated owing to the sudden appearance of a light in heaven, which revealed the advancing enemy, so kind of gave them away. And it was taken as an omen by the Byzantines of a special divine aid. So this happened around BC 339. In commemoration of it, they assumed as one of their civic badges, or their crests, the blazing crescent and star, which has descended to our own days and is still used as an emblem by the present owners of the city, the Ottoman sultans, the Turks. But after repulsing Philip, the Byzantines had to submit some years later to his son Alexander. They formed under him part of the enormous Macedonian Empire and passed on his decease through the hands of his successors, Demetrius, Poliorcetes, and Lysimachus. After the death of Lysimachus, they were again an independent community for 100 years until the power of Rome invaded the regions of Thrace and the Hellespont. Byzantium was one of the cities which took the wise course of making an early alliance with the Romans and obtained good and easy terms in consequence. During the wars of Rome with Macedon and Antiochus the Great, who that was the father of Antiochus Epiphanes, proved such a faithful assistant that the Senate gave it the status of civitas libera et federata, meaning a free and confederate city. And it was not taken under direct Roman government, but allowed complete liberty in everything except for the control of its foreign relations and the required payment of a financial tribute to Rome. It was not until the Roman Republic had long passed away that the Emperor Vespasian stripped it of these privileges. So we know Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus for when they sacked Jerusalem, right, in 70 AD. Well, from 67 to 70 AD. So if that name sounds familiar, that's why. So let's see. Though deprived of a liberty which had for a long many years had been nominal, Byzantium could not be deprived of its unrivaled position for commerce. It continued to flourish under the Pax Romana, the long-continued peace which all of the inner countries of the empire enjoyed during the first 2 centuries. Okay, so moving on then. The strong Illyrian emperor. So remember, Illyricum was a prefecture. It was an area controlled by the Caesar underneath the Augusti of the Eastern Empire. Okay, and I was interested to learn that quite a few Roman emperors actually came from Illyria. So it says the strong Illyrian emperors who staved off from the Roman Empire the ruin, so they kept the Roman Empire from ruin, which appeared about to overwhelm it in the 3rd quarter of the 3rd century. And that gave Byzantium time and peace to recover its ancient prosperity. It profited especially from the constant neighborhood of the imperial court after Diocletian had fixed his residence at Nicomedia, only 60 miles away on the Bithynian side of the Propontis. But the military importance of Byzantium was always interfering with its commercial greatness. After the abdication of Diocletian, the empire was for 20 years vexed by constant partitions of territory between the colleagues whom he had left behind him with his tetrarchy. Okay. Byzantium, after a while, found itself the border fortress of Licinius, the emperor who ruled in the Balkan Peninsula while Maximinus was governing the Asiatic provinces. While Licinius was absent in Italy, Maximinus treacherously attacked his rival's dominions without declaration of war. So he attacked it but didn't declare war, and took Byzantium by surprise. But the Illyrian emperor returned in haste. Licinius defeated Maximinus not far from the walls of the city and recovered his great frontier fortress after it had been only a few months out of his hands, and this was in AD 314. But Licinius, when he had recovered the place, set to work to render it impregnable so that it couldn't be breached. Though it was not his capital, he made it the chief fortress of his realm, which, since the defeat of Maximinus, embraced the whole eastern half of the Roman world, the whole eastern half of the empire. It was accordingly at Byzantium that Licinius made his last desperate stand when in AD 323, he found himself engaged in an unsuccessful war with his brother-in-law Constantine, the emperor of the West. For many months, the war stood still beneath the walls of the city. So here we have Constantine, who's emperor of the West, and we have Licinius, who is his brother-in-law, as emperor of the East, or prefecture of the East. And we're having conflict. So Constantine persevered in the siege, raising great mounds which overlooked the walls. So he raised great mounds so big that they could actually get up and look over the walls, and sweeping away the defenders by a constant stream of missiles launched from dozens of military engines, which he had erected on these artificial mounds. At last the city surrendered, and the cause of Licinius was lost. Constantine, the last of his rivals, subdued, became the sole emperor of the Roman world, and stood a victor on the ramparts which were ever after to bear his name. So here is a statue of Constantine the Great, which I find interesting, is actually sitting in England, in York. So I looked that up, and apparently that's where his father Constantinius died, and so he was recognized as taking over from his father with this statue, which is in York. So it says Constantine I was born in 274 AD in Nisus, which is modern-day Nice, Serbia. His father was Constantius Chlorus, and his mother Helena was actually the second wife of Constantius. And Helena herself was born in Bithynia. Now, I can't say for sure, but when I was doing some looking into Helena, a reference kept coming back that she was related to King Cole of Britain. You guys remember that nursery rhyme about old King Cole was a merry old soul? So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what kept coming up. Now, I think you guys will find this interesting, and we're getting down to our last few slides for today's video. This is chapter 2, same book, The Foundation of Constantinople. I think you guys will find this very interesting. So we're talking about AD 328 to AD 330. When the fall of Byzantium had wrecked the fortunes of Licinius, the Roman world was again united beneath the scepter of a single master. For 37 years, ever since Diocletian parceled out the provinces with his colleagues, unity had been unknown, and emperors, whose number had sometimes risen to 6 and sometimes sunk to 2, had administered their realms on different principles and with varying success. Constantine, whose victory over his rivals had been secured by his talents as an administrator and a diplomatist, no less than by his military skill, so meaning he was as great a diplomat as he was a military leader, was one of those men whose hard practical ability has stamped upon the history of the world a much deeper impress than has been left by many other conquerors and legislatures of infinitely greater genius. He was a man of that self-contained, self-reliant, unsympathetic type of mind, which we recognize in his great predecessor Augustus, or in Frederick the Great of Prussia, meaning he has that same tenacity. And if you read up on him, like through Wikipedia or Britannica, whatever, it said that he did not have a lot of compassion when it came to his family. He was extremely hard and severe with his family members. Though the strain of old Roman blood in his veins must have been very small, Constantine was in many ways a typical Roman. The hard, cold, steady, unwearying energy which in earlier centuries had won the empire of the world was once more incarnate in him. But if Roman in his character, he was anything but Roman in his sympathies. He was born by the Danube, reared in the courts and camps of Asia and Gaul. He was absolutely free from any of that superstitious reverence for the ancient glories of the city He was free from the superstitious reverence for the ancient glories of the city on the Tiber, which had inspired so many of his predecessors before him. Italy was to him nothing but a secondary province amongst his wide realm. When he distributed his dominions among his heirs, it was Gaul that he gave as the noblest share to his eldest and best loved son. Italy was to him a younger child's portion. So he had more affinity for the land and region of Gaul than he did Rome itself. There had been emperors before him who had neglected Rome. The barbarian Maximinus I had dwelt by the Rhine and by the Danube. The politic Diocletian had chosen Nicomedia as his favorite residence, but no one had yet dreamed of raising up a rival to the mistress of the world and of turning Rome into a provincial town. If preceding emperors had dwelt far afield, it was to meet the exigencies of war on the frontiers or the government of distant provinces. It was reserved for Constantine alone to erect over against Rome a rival metropolis for the civilized world, an imperial city which was to be neither a mere camp nor a mere court, but would be the administrative and commercial center of the Roman world. For more than 100 years, Rome had been a most inconvenient residence for the emperors. The main problem which had been before them was the repelling of incessant barbarian inroads on the Balkan Peninsula. The troubles on the Rhine and the Euphrates, although real enough, had been but minor evils. Rome, placed halfway down the long projection of Italy, handicapped by its bad harbors and separated from the rest of the empire by the passes of the Alps, was too far away from the points where the emperor was most wanted, which was by the banks of the Danube and the walls of Sirmium and Sinigdunum. For the ever-recurring wars with Persia, it was even more inconvenient. But these were less pressing dangers. No Persian army had yet penetrated beyond Antioch, which was only 200 miles from the frontier, while in the Balkan Peninsula, the Goths had broken so far into the heart of the empire as to sack Athens and Thessalonica. So Constantine, with all of the Roman world at his feet and all of its responsibilities weighing on his mind, was far too able a man to overlook the great need of the day, that being a more conveniently placed administrative and military center for his empire. He required a place that should be easily accessible by land and sea, which Rome had never been in spite of its wonderful roads. It should overlook the Danube lands without being too far away from the east. That should be so strongly situated that it might prove an impregnable arsenal and citadel against barbarian attacks from the north, and that it should at the same time be far enough away from the turmoil of the actual frontier to afford a safe and splendid residence for the imperial court. The name of several towns are given by historians as having been suggested to Constantine. First was his own birthplace, Nisus, which was on the Morava in the heart of the Balkan Peninsula. But Nisus had little to recommend. It was too close to the frontier and too far from the sea. Sardica, which is the modern Sofia in Bulgaria, was liable to the same objections and had not the sole advantage of Nisus, that of being connected in sentiment with the emperor's early days. Nicomedia, on its long gulf at the east end of the Propontis, was a more eligible situation in every way and had already served as an imperial residence. But all that could be urged in favor of Nicomedia applied with double force to Byzantium. And in addition, Constantine had no wish to choose a city in which his own memory would be eclipsed or overshadowed by that of his predecessor Diocletian, and whose name was associated by the Christians, which were a class of subjects whom he had most favored of late, with the persecutions of Diocletian and Galerius. For Ilium, the last place on which Constantine had cast his mind as a potential place to live, nothing could be alleged except its ancient legendary glories and the fact that the mythologists of Rome had always fabled that their city drew its origin from the exiled Trojans of Aeneas. Although close to the sea, it had no good harbor, and it was just too far from the mouth of the Hellespont to command effectually the exit of the Euxine, which was the Black Sea. So Byzantium, on the other hand, was thoroughly well known to Constantine. For months his camp had been pitched beneath its walls. He must have known accurately every inch of its environs, and none of its military advantages can have missed his eye. Nothing then could have been more natural than his selecting of the old Megarian city for his new capital. Yet the Roman world was startled at the first news of his choice. Byzantium had been so long known merely as a great port of call for the Euxine trade and as a first-class provincial fortress that it was hard to conceive of it as a destined seat of the empire. When once Constantine had determined to make Byzantium his capital, in preference to any other place in the Balkan lands, his measures were taken with its usual energy and thoroughness. The limits of the new city were at once marked out by solemn processions in the old Roman style. In later ages, a picturesque legend was told to account for the magnificent scale on which it was planned. The emperor, we read, marched out on foot, followed by all of his court, and he traced, using his spear, the line where the new fortifications were to be drawn. As he paced on further and further westward along the shore of the Golden Horn, till he was more than 2 miles away from his starting point, the gate of Old Byzantium, his attendants grew more and more surprised at the vastness of his scheme. At last they ventured to observe that he had already exceeded the most ample limits of an imperial city could require. But Constantine turned to rebuke them, and he said, "I shall go on," he said, "until he, the invisible guide who marches before me, thinks fit to stop." Guided by his mysterious presentiment of greatness, the emperor advanced on until he was 3 miles from the eastern angle of Byzantium, and only turned his steps when he had included in his boundary line all of these 7 hills which are embraced at the peninsula between the Propontis and the Golden Horn. And I put that in a red box for a reason, because we're always hearing about the 7 hills of Rome, right? Well, Byzantium also had 7 hills. So The rising ground just outside the walls of the old city where Constantine's tent had been pitched during the siege of BC 323, well, I think that's supposed to be AD. I think that was supposed to be AD 323, was selected out as the marketplace of the new foundation. There he erected the Milion, or the golden milestone, from which all of the distances of the Eastern world were in the future to be measured. So it's a type of measuring reference. The central point of the world was not a mere single stone, but a small building like a temple. Its roof supported by 7 pillars, and within this was placed the statue of the emperor, Constantine, together with that of a statue of his venerated mother, the Christian empress Helena. So before I go on, I do want to say that from everything that I have read regarding Constantine, I do not believe he ever actually became a Christian. He was extremely close to his mother, extremely close, loved her dearly. And there is, fairly good evidence to suggest that she was a Christian, maybe a new Christian, but or she at least considered herself a Christian. And I think that was a large factor in his being sympathetic to the Christians and stopping the persecution of them. But being sympathetic to Christians and stopping their persecution, for the sake of his love for his mother, isn't the same thing as he himself becoming a Christian. Okay? He, from everything I can determine, was very much a deist. His main deity was Mithra, the sun god, of which the Sol Invictus. So if he acknowledged Christianity in any way, it would have just been one of the many religions that he embraced. Okay. So I just want to make that clear. The southeastern part of the old town of Byzantium was chosen by Constantine for the site of his imperial palace. The spot was cleared of all private dwellings for a space of 150 acres to give space not only for the magnificent residence for which his whole court, but also for the spacious gardens and pleasure grounds. A wall commencing at the lighthouse, where the Bosphorus joins the Propontis, turned inland and swept along the parallel shore for about a mile in order to shut off the imperial precinct from the city. Northwest of the palace lay the central open space in which the life of Constantinople was to find its center. This was the Augustusium, a splendid oblong forum about 1,000 feet long by 300 feet wide. It was paved with marble and surrounded on all sides by stately public buildings. So he had all of this built. That is my understanding. There may have been some things there from the previous Greeks, but by and large, he built a lot of these things. It was paved, so the Augustium was paved with marble and surrounded on all sides by stately public buildings, which you can see to the right on the diagram. Again, you might want to take a screenshot and then make it bigger so you can see what each of those buildings were. And he is credited with building the original Hagia Sophia, or the Saint Sophia Church. Okay, it was much smaller and more simpler than what we see the remains of today. But you can see from the diagram on the right what his building projects were. To its east, as we have already said, lay the imperial palace, But between the palace and the open space were 3 detached edifices connected by a colonnade. Of these, the most easternly was the Great Baths, or the public baths, known from their builder as the Baths of Zeuxippus. They were built on the same magnificent scale which the earlier emperors had used in Old Rome, although they could not perhaps vie in size with the enormous baths of Caracalla. Caracalla, I believe, was a military leader, or he might have been an emperor. I can't remember which. Constantine utilized and enlarged the old public bath of Byzantium, which had been rebuilt after the taking of the city by Emperor Severus. He adorned the frontage and courts of the edifice with statues taken from every prominent town of Greece and Asia, and the old Hellenic masterpieces which had escaped the rapacious hands of the 12 generations of plundering proconsuls and Caesars. So he has all of these statuary and all of these masterpieces all throughout the area of Greece that managed to survive, and he has them brought to Constantinople in Byzantium. There were to be seen the Athene of Lindus, the Amphithrite of Rhodes, the Pan, which had been consecrated by the Greeks. So I'm assuming these are all gods. So I'm not sure if Athene is Athena. The Amphithrite of Rhodes, Pan, which had been consecrated by the Greeks after the defeat of Xerxes, and then a statue of Zeus. And adjoining the baths to the north lay the second great building on the east side of the Augusteum, and that was the Senate House. Constantine had determined to endow his new city with a senate modeled on that of Old Rome, and had indeed persuaded many old senatorial families to migrate eastward by judicious gifts of pensions and promised houses to come to Byzantium and to Constantinople. We know that the assembly was worthily housed, but no details survive about Constantine's building on account of its having been twice destroyed within the century. But like the baths of Zeuxippus, it was adorned with ancient statuary, among which the 9 muses of Helicon are specially cited by the historian who describes the burning of the place in 404. I don't know why that says BC 404. I don't know, maybe that was there when it was still under the Megarians. I'm not sure. Linked to the Senate House by a colonnade lay on the north side the palace of the Patriarch, as the Bishop of Byzantium was long known to be called. So on the north was the palace of the bishop, the spiritual father. Was long to be called when raised to the same status as his brethren of Antioch and Alexandria. A fine building in itself with a spacious hall of audience and gardens, the patriarchal dwelling of the bishop was yet completely overshadowed by the imperial palace of Constantine, which rose behind it. And so it was with the patriarch, or the bishop himself. He lived too near to his royal master to be able to gain any kind of independent authority. Physically and morally alike, he was too much overlooked by his neighbor, Constantine, and never found the least opportunity of setting up an independent spiritual authority over against the civil government, or of founding an imperium imperio like the Bishop of Rome had in Old Rome. All along the western side of the Augusteum, Facing the three buildings, which we have already described, lay an edifice which played a very prominent part in the public life of Constantinople. This was the Great Hippodrome, a splendid circus 640 cubits long and 160 cubits wide, in which were renewed the games that old Rome had known so well. The whole system of the chariot races between the teams that represented the factions of the circus was reproduced at Byzantium with an energy that even surpassed the devotion of the Romans to horse racing. From the first foundation of Constantinople, the rivalry of the blue factions and the green factions was one of the most striking features of the life of the place. It was carried far beyond the circus and spread into all branches of life. We often hear of the green faction identifying itself with Arianism, or of the blue faction supporting a pretender to the throne. Not merely men of just sporting interests alone, but persons of all ranks and professions chose their color and backed their faction. The system was a positive danger to the public peace and constantly led to riots, culminating in the Great Sedition of AD 523, which we will get to when we get to that time period, which we shall presently have to describe at length. In the Hippodrome, the Greens always entered by the northeastern gate and sat on the east side. The Blues approached by the northwestern gate and stretched along the western side. The Emperor's box, called the Kathisma, occupied the whole of the short northern side and contained many hundreds of seats for the imperial retinue. The great central throne of the Kathisma was the place in which the monarch showed himself most frequently to his subjects, and around it many strange scenes were enacted. It was on this throne that the rebel Hypatius was crowned emperor by the mob, with his own wife's necklace for an impromptu diadem. Here also, 2 centuries later, the Emperor Justinian II sat in state after his reconquest of Constantinople, with his rivals Leontius and Asperamus bound beneath his footstool, while the populace chanted, in allusion to the names of the vanquished princes, the verse, "Thou shalt trample on the lion and the asp." So here, to the right, you can see a drawing of what they call the at median, or the Hippodrome, and then also St. Sophia. And it says, down the center of the Hippodrome ran the spine, or the division wall, which every circus showed. It was ornamented with 3 most curious monuments, whose strange juxtaposition seemed almost to typify the heterogeneous materials from which the new city was built. The first and oldest was an obelisk brought in from Egypt and covered with the usual hieroglyphic inscriptions. The second was the most notable, though one of the least beautiful, of the antiquities of Constantinople, and it was the 3-headed brazen serpent, which Pausanias, we'll get to that in a second. So here to the left, we see a picture of the more modern day Hagia Sophia, or Saint Sophia, and then the obelisk. And then I found a modern day picture of it. It's still standing. And I was able to make it lighter so we could see the hieroglyphs on it. The second was the most notable, though it was the least beautiful of the antiquities of Constantinople. It was the 3-headed brazen serpent. And so on the left, all we have left is just this blue-green patina stand. And then there is a remnant of one of the serpent heads. But here is a drawing of what it would have looked like standing, and it was quite tall. So again, I ask, if Constantine had converted to Christianity, why would he be bringing in statues of Zeus and of Athena and of Pan, and bringing in this obelisk from Egypt and then this three-headed serpent, right? He wouldn't do that if he was a true believer or a true follower of Messiah. So that Pausanias and the victorious Greeks had dedicated that coiled stand with the three serpent heads. They had dedicated it at Delphi, with the Oracle of Delphi, in 479 BC, after they had destroyed the Persian army at Plataea. The golden tripod, which was supported by the heads of the serpents, had long been wanting. The sacrilegious Phocians had stolen it 6 centuries before, but the dedicatory inscriptions engraved on the coils of the pedestal survived then and survive now, to the delight of archaeologists. And then the third monument that was on the spine of that wall was a square bronze column of more modern work, contrasting strangely with the venerable antiquity of its neighbors. By some freak of chance, all 3 monuments have remained until our own day. The vast walls of the Hippodrome have crumbled away, but its central decorations still stand erect in the midst of an open space, which the Turks call the Atmedian, or the place of horses, in dim memory of its ancient use. Along the outer eastern wall of the Hippodrome, on the western edge of the Augusteum, stood a range of small chapels and statues, the most important landmark among them being the Milion, or the central milestone of the empire, which we have already described. The statues, few at first, were increased by later emperors until they extended along the whole length of the Forum. Constantine's own contribution to the collection was a tall porphyry column surmounted by a bronze image, which had once been the tutelary Apollo of the city of Hierapolis, but was turned into a representation of the emperor by the easy method of knocking off its head and substituting the imperial features. It was exactly the reverse of a change which can be seen today in Rome, where the popes have removed the head of the Emperor Aurelius and turned him into St. Peter on the column of Corso. So again, this just goes to show that a lot of the statuary in Rome, where you see all of the statues of the saints or certain figures, were old gods or demigods or old emperors, right? That they knocked the heads off and tried to remake them into Christian persons. North of the Hippodrome stood the great church which Constantine erected for his Christian subjects and dedicated it to the divine wisdom, the Hagia Sophia. That's why it's named that. It was not the famous domed edifice which now bears that name, but an earlier and humbler building, probably of the basilica shape than what we see. It burnt down once in the 5th century and then once again in the 6th century. So it burned down the first time in the 400s AD and then again in the 500s AD. And it has left no trace of its original character. And again, we'll come back to that. So again, what I want to point out is Constantine had this church, the Hagia Sophia, built for his Christian subjects, which really, when we say Christian, it's not the Judeo-Christian. It's what became the Catholicism, right? Which it's a lot of Catholicism is a lot of amalgamation of the various, or it has become an amalgamation of the various pagan religions, right? And so the divine wisdom, which is they call Sophia, the Gnostics especially will call the divine wisdom Sophia, which I'm also wondering if the divine wisdom is the same thing as like what we hear a lot today about the divine feminine. I think it's an entity, and it might also play into the Queen of Heaven, perhaps, which again the Catholics have tried to deify the mother of Jesus, the mother of of Yeshua, but she herself would have never been okay with that. And the Judeo-Christian apostles and disciples and that early church never would have done that. So there's something really weird and hinky regarding this divine wisdom, this Sophia, this divine, the wisdom being the name of Sophia. And I do think it ties into the Queen of Heaven or the divine feminine, which again is has nothing to do with Christianity. It was so going down, it says, from the west door of St. Sophia, a wooden gallery supported on arches crossed the square and finally ended at the royal gate of the palace. By this, the emperor would take himself to divine service without having to cross the street of the market, which lay opposite of St. Sophia. The general effect of the gallery must have been somewhat like that of the curious passages perched aloft on arches in Florence. The edifices which we have described form the heart of Constantinople. Between the palace, the hippodrome, and the cathedral, most of the important events in the history of the city took place. But to the north and west, the city extended for miles, and everywhere there were buildings of note, though no other cluster could vie with that around the Augusteum. A statue of Constantine on horseback, which stood by the last named edifice, was one of the chief shows of Constantinople down to the end of the Middle Ages. It was in AD 328 or 329, the exact date is not easily to be fixed, that Constantine had definitely chosen Byzantium for his capital and drawn out the plan for its development. As early as May 11th, 330, the buildings were so far advanced that he was able to hold the festival which celebrated its consecration. Now, I find this this picture to be very interesting. Seems we have a naked Constantine on horseback, but what I find interesting is he's pointing to the sun, which to me I think may lend back to his worship of Mithra, the sun god. And so maybe one of his more important deities. Again, not Christian, not Judeo-Christian. On the completion of the dedication festival in 330 AD, an imperial edict gave the city the title of New Rome. So there was Old Rome and then New Rome. And the record was placed on a marble tablet near the equestrian statue of the emperor opposite the Strategion. But New Rome was a phrase destined to subsist only in poetry and rhetoric alone. The world, from the very first, rightly gave the city the founder's name and persisted in calling it Constantinople after Constantine. Okay. Well, you guys, that is all I have for this presentation. Again, I apologize for the confusion at the beginning. This is presentation, or part 7. And hope you guys found the information about Byzantium and Constantine and the founding of Constantinople, because we really are not taught much about that, and I do believe that that is by design, which we'll get into more in the next 2 to 3 videos as we move forward. And so at any rate, I will put the link, I will have the link to this thing that we're reading, this on Byzantium. I will put that in the video's description, and then I will see you for the next video. And I'm hoping and praying that time is going to allow me to get the next video out a little quicker. I thank you guys so much for being patient, and sorry that it's my time is kind of feast or famine, and I'm a mom first and foremost, and these children are keeping me busy. So anyway, okay, take care, and I will see you for the next video. All right, bye-bye.